Okay, so thanks everybody for attending. I'm going to go ahead and dive right in because if you haven't heard yet, there is a lot to cover whenever we're talking about Azure specifically for the enterprise. And again, only can cover so much in a 60-minute webinar. So what I've done is I think I've picked a lot of the really good topics that whenever we deliver training to enterprise customers that we get a lot of really good feedback and a lot of good interest on. And we're going to try to talk about those. But again, there's tons of stuff that we're not able to cover. So we'll do the best as we can in 60 minutes. I think hopefully everyone will be pretty happy with what we've came up with so far. Again, my name is Michael Washam. I'm the CEO of Opstability. So all the amazing stuff that Javier just told you about, that's basically what we make happen. So lots of fun. We big practice on focusing on Microsoft Cloud from everywhere from Azure to 365. So a little bit of everything going on with us. So let's go ahead and get started. Just one of the things I like doing with these webinars is really just kind of talking about the very basics. If you haven't done too much with Azure, just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page before we even get going too deep. The very first thing you should know about Azure is huge. It is literally all across the planet. Currently it's in 38 regions worldwide, and whenever you're talking about a region in Azure, what a region is actually a single location that has more than one data center. So there's literally 60 to 100 data centers spread across the world right now that you can just with a couple of clicks of the mouse actually go deploy workloads into. So it's a gigantic hyperscale is what Microsoft calls it, and you know, if you look at the map and the sheer amount of money that they've invested in this infrastructure, it certainly lives up to that description. So that's basically where we're starting from, is Azure is a global hyperscale cloud infrastructure. Now, whenever we're talking about beyond the infrastructure, what does Azure actually consist of? And this is where it gets kind of confusing. A long time ago, I've been working in Azure for a really long time, and back then you could literally, you know, back in 2009, 2010, you could certainly call yourself an Azure expert. At this point, there's absolutely no way, because the Azure platform is just so evolved and so broad that it covers just a gigantic section of technology. You know, down at the bottom here, the data center infrastructure, these are the 38 regions, 34 now, 4 coming soon, that I just mentioned. And on top of that, in that actual infrastructure, you have things like Infrastructure-as-a-Service, which we'll talk about today. And infrastructure services, or IaaS, consists of compute, storage, and networking. Now, if you look inside of each of these, you know, big buckets, there's all kinds of different services. You know, in the networking, it could be, you know, virtual networking, it could be configuring load balancing, or it could be doing hybrid connectivity between your data center and Microsoft's data center using things like ExpressRoute. It's a very wide list of services that you kind of get an understanding of whenever you're starting to integrate this into the enterprise. And on top of infrastructure, there's a whole set of PaaS and SaaS services that you can actually build and integrate your enterprise with as well. So in the middle piece, and we'll talk about this more towards the end, you have the platform services section. So these are all the different services that your developers will use to actually build net new applications. And they have things, you know, from the web and mobile with Azure Web Apps and API management, mobile apps, etc., that your developers can use to quickly build new web applications that maybe they're the front end site like Opstability.com, or maybe they're an intranet site that maybe you used to host on an internal IaaS server before. Now you can just host it somewhere up in the cloud without any servers. And we'll talk a lot more about platform as a service later, but just so you know that there's a broad set of services here in the PaaS world that serves lots of different purposes. Web and mobile, you also have analytics and IoT. So taking all the data that you have in your organization and actually getting some value out of it is a huge benefit that used to, it was actually insanely difficult to do, but now there's a ton of built-in services that are just kind of baked into Azure that if you have a sharp developer that they can actually put together a meaningful solution for. And then outside of the platform as a service space, you have all kinds of additional services that would apply in the enterprise world, and these are all the way from security and management space all the way over to services that help you build a better hybrid cloud. And we'll talk a lot about all these, or some of these, as we go through the webinar. So the very first thing that you should know, if you've never seen Azure before, the primary interface for using it is actually, as you guessed, portal.azure.com. If you're looking at it from a different perspective, maybe you're actually using it from GovCloud, it would be portal.azure.us, and there's actually several other portals depending on which version of Azure you're using. But for the most part, if you're using the public sector cloud, that's always going to be portal.azure.com. From within the portal, this is where you can actually go in and create the different resources that we just described. You can go and manage and monitor your bill, and of course you can actually set up permissions so you can allow other people within your enterprise access to managing resources. So it's kind of like your user interface for your virtual data center is the best way you could look at this guy. And the other thing you should know is you can actually log into the Azure portal without a subscription, but of course you can't do anything. The very first thing you need to do to actually do something useful in Azure is you need to acquire an Azure subscription. Now, what is a subscription? It's really just a container that you put resources in that all the costs go to a single bill. That's the easiest way you can look at it. So if you have a subscription that comes with your MSDN subscription, you can access Azure that way and you will get a bill, and whenever you actually create your resources, you'll always pick the subscription to create that resource in. So it's really simple, but just kind of think of it as a place to put your bill at. And there's a couple of different ways you can get a subscription. If you've never done one, you can go to azure.com and there's a free account button at the top right. You can click and it'll give you a $200 free trial just to go off and play around and do whatever you want to with it, just so you can kind of get your hands dirty. And the second thing is if you already have an MSDN subscription, like I kind of mentioned, there's a Azure benefit that's already baked into those subscriptions as is today. So if you have an MSDN, go activate your Azure benefits and you can actually start using it today without actually spending any more than you already are. And the third way is if you actually start needing to use this for real, then you probably will start buying a pay-as-you-go subscription. And this is essentially putting a credit card into Azure and letting them bill you for your consumption. And then there's two additional ways, and this is more typical for the enterprise space. If you're a reseller, maybe you're a cloud solution provider, or you as a customer are working with a cloud solution provider, they can sell you access to Azure directly, and usually there's a lot of additional premium services that go on top of this, such as managing your backups through your infrastructure or supporting your end users. Lots of resellers offer these value-add services on top of Azure. And finally, if you are buying a Azure directly from Microsoft, you can actually buy an enterprise agreement. And the enterprise agreement essentially lets you manage all of your subscriptions for your entire company directly. And we'll talk a little bit about that later today. But just know that the very first thing that you need to do to actually use Azure is you have one of these subscriptions. All right, so let's pop out, and I'm going to give all the people that have never really used a portal a really quick overview of what it looks like. So what you're looking at here is portal.azure.com, and this is a kind of a messy version of it because I have a bunch of stuff I've already created for this webinar, but essentially this is the Azure management portal that you would use, or your infrastructure team or developers would use, to create and manage resources in the cloud. So over here on the left, you can see a bunch of different services. These are a lot of the same ones that you saw in the PowerPoint slide earlier, like app services and SQL database. And if I click under more, this is where you can convince your friends that there's no way to ever be an Azure expert. As you can see, I can scroll down for a long time and still I'm seeing new services. So this is where you can actually go to find everything that you can deploy in Azure. Now, what the little star menu on the left means is this is how I can kind of control what shows up on my navigation menu. So if I always want to make sure I can jump right into billing or virtual machine scale sets for that matter, I can kind of adjust what goes in here and shows up on my menu. Now beyond that, if I want to create a resource, I go to New, and this is where it's going to give me a whole bunch of different categories, which is compute, networking, storage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all I really have to do is go in here and browse a different type of resource that I want to create and fill in the configuration information, and it'll actually start spinning it up in the data center I pick. And I'll show you that here in just a few minutes. Now a couple other little odds and ends I want to show you before I jump out of here too much is if you find yourself in the Azure portal a lot, one of the things you may want to get used to is using some of the keyboard shortcuts. So if I go under Help and I click on Keyboard Shortcuts, you can see that we have all kinds of little actions that we can take. For instance, if I wanted to press N instead of click on my mouse, it'll pop me out to the new menu. And the same thing with Browse, and not in that menu, of course, but if I wanted to browse, I could do the same thing. And all driven directly by the keyboard. I have a feeling that this feature was built by the Azure portal developers because they were tired of clicking everywhere, but it can come in handy for the rest of the world too. So speaking of the Azure portal developers, one other little feature I will share with everyone is the smiley face or the feedback button. And what this really is a way of giving feedback directly to the Azure portal team. And why would I highlight this? Well, the one thing I will say is, as a training company, we see the evolution of the Azure management portal probably more than anyone else other than the people that are changing it. So anytime anything changes, we realize it because it usually breaks our labs. And one of the things that we also see is if the portal is broken, if there's a bug in it, we're also the first people to explore it because all of our students are also running into that same bug. We have literally decidedly given feedback through this portal before in the morning and had the portal fixed by the evening. So just keep that in mind. If you see something that's not working quite right or something you love, this is a direct feedback directly to the developers and the PMs that build this, and they take this feedback very seriously. A couple of other little gotchas here. If I go to settings, I don't think this is that great of a feature, but it's kind of cool. If you want to change the color of your background portal, you can really change your theme up a little bit. If you're on a slow connection, you can disable animations and all kinds of other little gotchas here that you can play around with in the portal to make it feel like a little bit more yours. Now, a few more things I'm going to show you before we jump on is that I do have a couple of virtual machines that I've already spun up. So if I click on virtual machines, and when I say a couple, I mean about 10. At the very bottom, you can see that we have a Webinar WinVM and a Webinar Linux VM. So I'm going to show you real quick just how easy it is to connect to a virtual machine that I've spun up in Azure. So if I open this up, this is my Windows virtual machine, and you can see that I just spun it up a while ago, so whenever it was spinning up, the CPU utilization was quite high. Same thing with the network, but now that it's been booted up, it's really not doing a whole lot. But if I want to connect to this VM, I click the connect button. It's going to dynamically generate a RDP file that I can literally just connect to. Now, the one thing I will say is this is connecting to a virtual machine over the public internet on a public IP. So this is fantastic for trying things out, learning how to do it. In the real world, you would not put this on a public IP if you were using this for production purposes. But it does just give you a good idea how you can actually connect to these VMs. Now, kind of the same concept for Linux, and yes, I'm assuming everyone knows, but just in case, you can run Linux in Azure. I can do the same concept that I can actually connect to it directly over the public IP. So I can see the public IP right here, and if I want to copy that, I can drop down to a bash shell. And now I'm logged directly into my Linux VM, so I can go install Apache or MySQL or run top, which is my favorite thing to do in a demo, and shows you how easy it is to get it connected to your Linux VMs as well. So again, Azure Management Portal is kind of your first stop to getting started with Azure. Super easy place to figure out how to spin up resources, and of course, delete them and stop them once you're done, because just remember that once you start these things in Azure, you're actually starting to pay for them at some point. All right, we'll circle back to virtual machines next, just to kind of go a little bit deeper here. So what is IaaS? And there's a reason I start with IaaS, and the reason is, especially in the enterprise, is 80 to 90% of all workloads running in Azure today in the enterprise are all running in infrastructure as a service. That doesn't mean that PaaS or big data is not popular. It just means that this is where enterprises start. They always start with VMs and networking, and then they work their way up the value-added chain. So before I kind of dive into the services a little bit, I want to kind of give it a little bit of a balance. What exactly are we talking about? So when we're talking about services in Azure, I always like to start with what you're used to today, and this is your on-premises world. In the on-premises world, you own a facility, so in reality, you are the air conditioner person. That's what you're responsible for, is making sure that all the servers don't melt down. So you're responsible for the facility, which comes with the AC bill, the security, the physical perimeter, all that stuff that's required to actually run a data center. On top of that, of course, is the physical hardware for your servers, the racks, the routers, the switches, the firmware updates, the maintenance, the hauling old servers out, the putting new servers in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, hopefully you're implementing some kind of virtualization stack, VMware, Hyper-V, something to help you manage all these resources. And on top of that, of course, you manage the operating system for each and every instance that you have out in existence, as well as the network, the firewall, the data, and of course your applications. So that's where you are today. Now, how does Azure stack up to this? So if we look at the infrastructure as a service world, where it really comes in is right where virtualization, hardware, and facility. These are really the three things that you're giving up or transferring ownership, I guess maybe a better version of it to Microsoft in exchange for a lowered management responsibility. So that means that you're still responsible for the operating system. That means if you deploy Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Windows Server 2016, you're still responsible for managing it, making sure it doesn't run out of disk space, managing the patches, making sure that they're all highly available and scaled correctly. There are things we can do to help mitigate that, of course, but that's still your responsibility. But that does mean you're completely out of the business of running virtualization and hardware, and of course, you're no longer in the data center business in this model. So you definitely get some significant benefits from going to the IaaS world. But you can kind of see this is why enterprises start, because they give up a lot of responsibility, but they still keep all the pieces that they're required to run their existing applications. Now, the other piece that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later is Platform as a Service. And what Platform as a Service is a set of services that your developers can use to build new applications that don't require underlying servers. So in this case, you essentially lose the operating system that you don't have to worry about anymore. You're not patching Windows anymore, you're not patching Linux, you're not making sure you have the right .NET framework or the right version of Node.js. That's up to the service that your developers are deploying to. Now, that doesn't mean you as an IT professional are off the hook. You, of course, still need to monitor the application to make sure it's available, make sure it's not crashing, make sure it's not, getting overrun with requests. There's still a lot of work to do here, but it does take a huge, huge burden off if you have an application that can be built as a PaaS. Now, keep in mind, there are, PaaS does not come free. This does require developers to actually build something. So in any enterprise, you'll usually see this first, and new applications to start going here. So in a longer term environment, it's a very healthy mix. Okay, so now that we kind of explained what infrastructure services in general, what does it actually mean in the Azure world? Well, there's really three services, and the first two we'll talk about are, of course, virtual machines themselves, and these are, they range anywhere from a single core with a measly 768 megs of memory all the way up to 32 cores and 448 gigs of memory. Also virtual networks, which is a service that allows you to virtualize your entire network. No more running cables or anything like that. It's all defined through a browser. Okay, virtual machines. Like I mentioned, virtual machines can run Windows Server anywhere from 2008 R2 and up to various versions of Linux, including Red Hat and even Oracle. So it's very flexible on which workloads you can run, and these are all officially supported in Microsoft Azure. Okay, the other thing you should know is whenever you go to define or create a virtual machine, you will see a huge different type or a number of types of virtual machines you can choose from. These anywhere from the A's on the very left side, these are kind of the cheapest, most efficient for doing low-cost processing, all the way to the very right. These are the very biggest workloads for running things like SAP HANA and big data and high compute workloads. And the thing about these is these are all different series. They're not actually instance sizes. So each one of these has anywhere from 5 to 15 options to choose from. So it might be a little daunting to try to make sure you're picking the right one, but it's also very flexible because you can choose the right workload for what you need. And keep in mind you pay for what you use here, so this makes it a lot easier to be flexible and optimize your spending by having this wide selections. Okay, so what I'm going to jump at now is I'm going to jump back to the portal, and I'm going to show how we can actually go create a VM. And before I create a VM, I'm going to annoy everyone, and I'm going to create a virtual network. And the reason I do that is very intentional, and it is because in general, in the enterprise world, you always want to start with the network. And if you don't, if you start with VMs and start deploying things and then you come and figure out your virtual network later, more than likely you will have done it wrong and you'll have to start over. So this is just kind of reinforced that it's the right thing to do, so we start with the network. Of course, my network is not going to be very complicated, so it's going to be called Webinar VNet, nothing too crazy. I can give it an address space. These are all the IP addresses that are available on my network. Now imagine you pick every 10.0 there is, and then you realize that your existing on-prem network has a 10.0, and someday you try to connect them in the future, they would overlap and things wouldn't quite work. So whenever you're thinking about virtual networks here, think of it just like you're connecting another data center to your existing network. Even though it's super easy, it's exactly the same concept. It does require planning. So in this case, we're not going to spend too much time though. And the other thing you can do is you can name your subnets, which is really fantastic. So I'm going to call mine apps, and in my case, I'm going to put this in a resource group. Now, what is a resource group? A resource group is a logical container that if I'm deploying a solution to, such as a demo environment for a webinar, I can put all my resources in the same place. That way, whenever I'm done with it, I can delete it. It deletes everything that I just created. But the more efficient, the more real use case is if I want to update or manage a solution as a single unit, I can do that. I can create a template that completely describes a single solution, and that could be virtual machines, it could be databases or networks or whatever, and I can actually modify that as a single unit. So it's a very fantastic way to really optimize your management of solutions. Now, the other thing I'm going to show here is the regions. So this is where we were just looking at deploying all of our regions in West Europe or Japan West or whatever. And just for the fun of it, I'm going to deploy into Japan West. Why not? I haven't deployed in Japan lately, so we'll do that. And this kind of shows you the capabilities of being able to deploy your resources anywhere where your customers are, which is really the big value add of having all these regions across the world. For a global company, that's an insanely expensive operation to undertake to do that themselves. So being able to leverage the investment that Microsoft has taken is really a huge advantage. Okay, so we've created a network. Now our network on its own doesn't really do anything useful until we put things in our network. So what I'm going to show you is really just how I created the virtual machines that I showed earlier. And in this case, I'm going to create a Windows Server 2016 data center instance. Call it Webinar Win16. Right off the bat, you can see that I can pick high performance SSD or the cheaper HDD. And of course, I'm always going to pick SSD because I'm impatient. Now I'm going to give it the local username and password for this machine. Do have to confirm, so hopefully we won't typo it. It's fantastic. And I'm going to put that resource group or this in the same resource group that I just created a while ago. And you see, if you already have Windows Server licensing, you can actually take advantage of those directly in Azure. So you'll only have to pay for the compute time instead of actually buying the Windows license again. So one thing to keep in mind, if you already have an enterprise agreement with Windows Server licensing built in, that's another way of cost optimizing your spending. Now, right off the bat, they're recommending a couple of the virtual machine instance sizes I can use to spin this virtual machine up. And you can see that at the bottom, it's giving me an estimated cost for for the virtual machine. And this one has 1 core, can support 2 data disks, but has different memory configurations. If I hit View All, you'll be able to see the much wider variety of virtual machine sizes that I could actually deploy this to. So since I'm not going to do too much, I will go ahead and stick with a DS1v2. Now here's where I can actually deploy my virtual network. See, it kind of already inferred that I wanted to use that, so it created a webinar VNet. I could choose to not deploy a public IP if I wanted to. So if I wanted to be a little security conscious, I could do that. I can also configure firewall rules. So right off the bat, this one will only have port 3389 open, but I could also open up port 80 or 443 or whatever service I needed to. So if I was deploying a SQL Server, I could open up 1433 right here. And this is kind of baked right into the portal experience. So a couple of other things that I can do here is I have a feature called extensions, and extensions allow me to take advantage of automation. For instance, if I wanted to make sure that whenever my virtual machine booted up, it ran a custom script to maybe install some software or download something or whatever I wanted it to do, I could do that. Or I could also have it install a Microsoft anti-malware extension, or if I wanted to integrate with Octopus Deploy or PowerShell or Chef or Puppet or whatever I wanted to do, it's super easy to bake that right into the VM at provision time. And again, the one thing you'll learn relatively soon is everything you can do through the portal, you can do through automation itself. So if I'm creating 100 virtual machines, I'm probably not going to be using the portal to do it, but I have other services that can take care of that for me. There's also built-in high availability options and monitoring that we can also enable on our virtual machines. But we'll go ahead and keep it simple and just let it do the final validation. And once we click OK, it's actually spinning up that virtual machine in Japan West right now as we speak. So again, very simple, very easy to get started spinning up new resources up in Azure. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the guts of Azure. What is it under the covers, or at least for virtual machines? One of the things you'll see prevalent across the entire landscape of Azure services is Azure storage. Any service that you use in Azure has a dependency on the service. So it's probably one of the ones that they really don't want to have an outage in because it kind of brings everything down. In this case, what Azure Storage is it is a platform as a service that basically represents stuff that you can store files or blobs, or it actually has some developer options for storing data in tables and even cross-tier communication with queues. So it's kind of a very generic service, but it's also insanely important. It comes in hot and cold tiers, and what that really means is if you're, like the files for your virtual machines, which are actually stored in the service, those would be considered hot because you're doing lots of reads and lots of writes, but they also have cold and cold tiers, which means if you have data that you're going to store in Azure, but you're really not looking to get it out, they're going to charge you significantly less to put it in. They will charge you more to get it out. So it's much more designed for archival and long-term storage versus active operations. And of course, Azure Storage also comes in standard and premium tiers specifically for virtual machines. And premium is based on SSD backend, so it's very high-end. It's a kind of disk that you'd want to use for your SQL servers or your Oracle backends, the ones that require low latency and lots of IOP throughputs. And now, how virtual machines work with storage is you might think that the disks in the rack in the data center actually hold your data, and they do to a degree. You can access the local disks, but it's very temporary. For instance, if the physical machine that your virtual machine is on dies, your virtual machine is going to boot up somewhere else. That means the data that you are using is also left on that machine. So where your data is stored is actually in a storage account, which is that separate PaaS service. Now the beauty of this is under the covers, automatically every file that you have on your VM, every disk or whatever, is replicated automatically 3 times within the same region. That means by default, it's already better than any traditional mirroring you typically do in the enterprise. Most people use N+1. This definitely beats that by at least another factor. Now, the really nice thing is if I needed to, I can actually turn on a feature called georeplication. And this is just a checkbox. And what georeplication will do is it will replicate all 3 of those copies to a remote region. So just by super simple default, I have 6 copies of every file that I have for my VM. So pretty straightforward to have a lot of really good redundancy at the physical disk level at least. Now keep in mind this is not a backup. If you accidentally delete the wrong file on this one, all it will do is replicate that accidental deletion to the other region. So not a replacement for a real backup. Okay, so let's talk real quick about storage, just so you can, again, going back into the portal and kind of giving you that experience of how relatively easy it is to configure a VM. We will go to the webinar WinVM that I configured earlier. And I'm going to open up disks. And all I have to do to add additional capacity here is just basically add data disk. I can tell it I want new, which would be an empty disk, or if I have an existing VHD that I've uploaded, I can actually attach that as an option here, existing blob. I can pick SSD or HDD. So just remember, whenever you create the VM as SSD, doesn't mean that every disk has to be SSD. You can certainly mix and match it to optimize the workload that you're using. Okay, and from there, I need to pick a storage container. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the same storage count that I'm currently using right now. And those disks are going to default to the VHDs container, which is essentially a folder inside your container. The other thing you should know is right now there is a limitation. Every data disk in Azure is maximum of 1,023 gigs. So not quite big enough for every workload you'll need, but definitely something that can be taken into consideration. All right, once I click save here, it's actually going to attach that virtual machine or that disk to the virtual machine. And if I logged into this Windows VM, it would actually pop up and tell me I have a new disk attached. So let's see. Real quick question is, are we getting a link to the recorded webinar? And that is absolutely yes. We will pop up a recorded version of this probably tomorrow, and it will be available then. Okay, so let's see, back to the presentation. And of course, there's lots of more stuff we can talk about with Azure Storage, but that one will get us started for today. Now, networking. Talk briefly about Azure Virtual Networks. The main thing I wanted to emphasize earlier is that you always start here, otherwise you'll end up messing it up and coming back here after the fact, and it's much better to get it right the first time. But at a high level, what a virtual network is essentially a method of bringing your network. It's a software-defined network, allows you to define your address ranges, your subnets, public IPs, everything that you need to deploy your infrastructure workload in the cloud. It supports bring your own DNS. So if I wanted to host my own DNS server in Azure and have all my virtual machines automatically boot up and know how to talk DNS with me, it supports that right out of the box. It also is the tool or the service that you will use to configure hybrid connectivity. So if you want to connect your data center to Azure, you're going to use one of two services, either virtual private networking or Azure Express Route. And both of those services are used to actually do that hybrid connectivity between data centers. It also offers some easy features like network security groups, which we kind of already saw, that basically are firewall rules that allow you to block inbound and outbound traffic by subnet. So one of the key things that we actually do to make subnets in Azure is so we can control network access between the different tiers. Traditionally on premises, you use subnets to segment traffic as well, but it's also to stop things like broadcast traffic. Well, in Azure, there's no broadcast traffic that goes across the network, so in reality, the only reason you create subnets is so you can segment the traffic using network security groups or more advanced firewalls that you can find in the Azure Marketplace. Okay, Azure offers a bunch of different options for doing load balancing. Very simple, the layer 2 Azure load balancer. This is kind of the basic load balancer that allows you to distribute traffic, whether it's HTTP or TCP. It doesn't really know too much about what's going on coming across the wire. The only thing it really does know is that you can specify health probes. So if it is HTTP, you can make it a little bit smarter. But beyond that, it really doesn't have too much insight into what's going on. There's also the Azure Application Gateway. This is a much more advanced load balancer. It is stateful, so it does do things like cookie-based affinity and round robin. It also supports things like SSL offloading, and it can even route traffic to certain servers in your network based on the URL accessing. And this actually does have a web application firewall feature built into it now that was just announced general availability very recently. So if you're looking at additional more advanced firewalls, beyond the plain old network security groups, that might be another option. But again, explore the Azure Marketplace because there's tons and tons of options from various ISVs like Barracuda and Barracuda and Kemp and F5, et cetera, that you can add on to this the built-in tool set that you get with Azure. One other service I want to mention here is Azure Traffic Manager. This is not really a load balancer. It's a traffic distribution is what the folks that I know that call it. But essentially, instead of distributing traffic at the network level, it distributes which IP address it resolves a DNS query to. And the use cases here are really if I wanted to distribute traffic between two data centers and not an individual virtual machine, but two entire data centers, I use Traffic Manager. I basically can register both of the endpoints with Traffic Manager, and it will detect if one of them is down or if my client is closer to one over the other, and it'll actually make the smart decisions for me to direct to resolve the correct IP for my client. Very advanced DNS piece software, and the use cases here are really to allow you to distribute traffic between multiple data centers, your data center and your data center in Azure, or even your Azure and another cloud provider like AWS or Google or whatever. It will absolutely distribute it because it's really just a DNS resolution service. Okay, so let's give you the Azure hybrid connectivity overview. There are definitely multiple ways to connect to a virtual network in Azure. The very first one we'll talk about is point-to-site networking. This is one that probably doesn't come up too often, but it's actually a very good use case for if you wanted to allow in remote administrators or developers, testers, whatever, into your virtual network using private IPs instead of that public IP. It's fantastic for that because everything goes over a secure VPN connection. The second option is site-to-site VPN. Now, unlike point-to-site, which just uses a single computer to a network, site-to-site allows an entire network to access your virtual network. You define the address ranges that are on premises to connect, and on both sides, and it basically goes over your existing internet connection using IPsec and allows a secure tunnel between the two networks. It's all completely defined by you, which addresses can talk to which addresses, relatively straightforward to do. But again, this is using your existing internet connection, and it has a bandwidth limitations per gateway. So it's certainly a very valuable piece of technology. But if you're looking at really large scale, where you're doing huge disaster recovery or really big data transfer between Azure and your enterprise, you're probably going to want to look at the third option, and this is Azure ExpressRoute. What ExpressRoute is a private site-to-site connectivity that allows you to basically go through either your colo provider or your MPLS provider to have a direct connection to the Azure network. So the bandwidth capacity is much, much higher. It's all the way up to 10 gigabits per second. Obviously, it's going to cost a lot more though. But it's really designed for those larger enterprise workloads. Just keep in mind that this does require that ExpressRoute partner to be where you're actually going to have your entry point into it. So it's either going to be a colo provider or it's going to be a networking provider. Okay, a couple of other options that I want to mention before we get out of the IaaS world, and that is automated deployment. So we saw how the portal works, and again, that's a fantastic way to get your workloads spun up the first time, see how they work and everything. But in the end, whenever you start doing Azure at scale, you're really going to want to start looking at some more automated options. And a couple of them that you'll get familiar with from the command line are the Azure PowerShell commandlets and the Azure CLI tools. And essentially everything that you can do in the Azure Management Portal, you can do from the CLI. And benefit here is, of course, if I want to create 100 of those VMs, I can, with just a simple couple lines of code versus actually having to go through that 100 times in the portal. And there are some use cases for doing that, although there's a better feature for that, and that's called templates. So whenever you're looking at automation options for deploying infrastructure, at least, there's lots and lots of other options to choose from too. But the very first two that you should think about is, when should I use the command line tools, or when should I define a template? And the way I look at these tools is if I want to manage existing infrastructure, right? If I want to stop a VM or reboot a VM or something, the command line tools are amazing. If I want to actually define infrastructure in a template, I want to use a template just because it's more designed for declarative deployments. Now, the two are used in combination, of course. I create a template using JSON, and I'll show you in just a second Visual Studio, and then I use the command line tools to actually make the deployment in an automated fashion. So again, they're not mutually exclusive. They will go hand in hand in a lot of cases. So again, another couple of real quick demos. What I'm going to show you very first is the Azure CLI tools. So the Azure CLI tools are cross-platform tools that run on Windows, Mac, or Linux, and basically all you have to do to run them is run the command Azure. There's actually a new version that's just a little bit shorter. It's just AZ. And the AZ command line and Azure command line are very, very similar, but they're just the AZ command line supersedes Azure. So these command lines, if you look at the help output here, you can see all the different resources you can manage, whether it's CDN or batch or availability sets, etc. So for instance, if I wanted to see which virtual machines I had running, I could type in Azure VM and then a verb, in this case list, and it's actually going to go off and tell me what virtual machines are running in my Azure subscription. And you can see the same thing. We could run Azure VM stop and tell the resource group name and the VM name, and we can actually manage that virtual machine's lifecycle directly from the command line. We can do the exact same thing if you're not a Bash person, you're more of a PowerShell person. We can run the get Azure RMVM commandlet, which is very similar to that. And essentially, once we run that, we'll get very similar output, except it's more from a PowerShell perspective than a Bash perspective. Now, one more thing I do want to show, and again, very short amount of time, there's so much to cover. We can't cover it all, but I do want to show you this just because this is, if you're looking at it from an enterprise for adopting Azure, this is one of the most important things you need to be considering, and that is truly embracing automation. So I'm going to show you real quick what I mean by that. So I'm going to create a new resource group project, and this is all Visual Studio. So if you're not a developer and you've never used Visual Studio, don't panic. I'll explain what it is. But essentially, I'm using Visual Studio to define a template. And you can see we have a bunch of starter templates like blank or Windows VM or web app and SQL, et cetera, et cetera. So Microsoft gives you a bunch of starter things that you can do. But I'm just going to kind of show you real quick how relatively straightforward it is. And again, it's not straightforward the first time you do this. So if you think I'm crazy, I'm not. It's only after about the 9th time that this is actually relatively easy. But we're going to create a project. And don't want to give feedback. And what I'm going to show you real quick is a template. Now the template itself is all written in JavaScript object notation, so JSON. And to a non-developer, it is, be honest, it's a little confusing when you first get started. But I'm going to kind of walk through just so you can see the process. Very first thing I'm going to do is add a resource to this template, because right now it's completely blank. We have not defined anything. So I'm going to go in and add a virtual network, just like we did in the portal. I'll call it webinar VNet template. And basically it just dropped a big chunk of code in here. That's all that UI did. And if you can see that we have some variables here. We have the template prefix. This is basically the subnet or the address space for our virtual network. Then we have the address spaces for 2 different subnets. So I can go ahead and deploy this as is, and it'll create the virtual network. So if I wanted to define that and then publish it out to Azure, it does take a few minutes while it authenticates, and it does this every time for some reason. Okay, now I can go ahead and create a new resource group, put it in a different region. We can use Japan West again, that sounds good. And you can see it's actually shelling out to call PowerShell. And under the covers, it's literally going to do a deployment directly to Azure using that template. So here in a few minutes, we'll actually have a new virtual network created in Japan West. So it's validating it. Might be hard to read this bottom here, but basically it's validating the template and it's executing it. Okay, while it's doing that, I'm going to jump out to the Azure portal, and I'm going to go look at those resource groups. Okay, here's the resource group we just created with our template, and we have our virtual network. And if I click on subnets, you can see the 2 subnets here. Now, what's awesome about this is why I'm saying that every enterprise should really look at this, is if I want to change the configuration of this, I don't have to go into the portal and do it. I can actually go into my source-controlled infrastructure code. So this is where infrastructure code comes from. And I can actually change these subnet names. And anything, there's of course limitations on what you can and can't change. But in this case, I can actually change these and give them a little bit better names. And now I can just go back and do the deployment again. And once it does this long, boring authentication, it'll actually take that same template, apply it to my existing virtual network, and make those changes. So you can imagine, like, if I wanted to resize virtual machines or add new network adapters, I can actually basically source control my infrastructure at this point. So it's a very powerful piece of technology. And of course, this template can deploy any resource there is in Azure, not just the network, but of course the VMs and PaaS services that go along with them. So again, definitely something to start taking a look at if you're not yet. Okay, so hybrid cloud. I really want to jump into hybrid cloud real quick because it's a huge topic, but the very first thing I want to do is just kind of dispel the confusion of what hybrid cloud is. What it is a buzzword that everyone talks about, but in reality, all it really is the ability to take your data center and connect it to, in this case, Azure's data center. Now, why would you want to do that? As you know, in any enterprise, it's never going to be an all or nothing migration. If you move workloads over to Azure, it's definitely, you're always going to have something back on-prem that you're talking to, whether it's talking to your existing Active Directory environment or SAP or whatever. I can't ever imagine a scenario where everything's going to go all over at once. And that's really where this hybrid cloud workload comes from. Some of your workloads may only run in Azure in the event that your primary data center fails, and that's a perfectly valid use case. So Microsoft does give you some tools to help manage this, and one of them that's very new, it's not even released yet, it's still in technical preview, is called Azure Stack. So Azure Stack is very interesting. It's basically it's going to be an appliance that's built by a certain set of vendors, and the software is provided by Microsoft. Now, this is going to be a very, very interesting solution to a lot of customers that have data sovereignty issues. So if you are a data sovereignty customer where you really have an issue putting your data up in the public cloud, or at least parts of your data in the public cloud, but you really are embracing Azure, it literally will give you the ability that if you build a template that runs in Azure Stack or PowerShell script or whatever that runs on Azure Stack, it will also run on Azure Public. And this should be a very interesting piece of technology once it gets released into the wild. But right now, if you're interested in learning more about this, there are solutions by HPE, Dell, and Lenovo. And I believe there's one more on the way, but this is going to be a complete solution with hardware and software. So it should be very interesting when it comes out. All right, other hybrid solutions that you should be aware of. Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory serves the same purpose that Active Directory on-premises does, except it is designed for authentication for services that run in the cloud. Not just Microsoft services, these are, of course, actually can be your services too, and we'll show you a quick demo of that at the very end. So Azure AD is responsible for doing identity for 365, Azure, of course, Intune, CRM Online, and thousands of other applications. So this is the ability to give yourself single sign-on across your on-prem applications and your cloud-based services and solutions. And why do we need Azure AD? Everyone probably already gets this, but if you have more than one email address at work, then you need Azure AD. It's definitely not an easy problem to solve, though, because you probably ended up with all these different SaaS logins long before Azure AD was even considered inside your organization. But the general idea here is to keep your employees from having to have a different login for Dropbox and Salesforce and WebEx, and provide a true single sign-on experience across your enterprise and your cloud-based applications. Okay, other solutions that Microsoft has in the stack to help in the hybrid cloud world, Operations Management Suite, and we're actually missing 2 or 3 services that are included in OMS, but just for brevity, some of the ones that we're going to focus on right now is Insight and Analytics. This is Log Analytics. Basically, it's a service that allows you to import data from multiple different services, whether it's Azure PaaS services or virtual machines or physical machines running on premises, or services running in AWS. Doesn't really matter. It's really a data gathering service that gives you a built-in query engine that you can really dig in and look at data across your entire enterprise. Very fantastic piece of software that really allows you to manage at scale. And there are service providers out there, I won't name them right now, but that use this exclusively to manage not just for their own infrastructure, but for their thousands of customers that are running in Azure today. So keep that in mind. It's a very powerful piece of analytical software for monitoring services and infrastructure. Automation and control. This is really Azure Automation. Azure Automation is a service that allows you to run PowerShell scripts on premises or in the cloud on a schedule, on demand, triggered, whatever your workload needs. It's a really systematic way of automating your environment. And it goes a long ways beyond that, including configuration management. So very similar to what Chef and Puppet do, except it uses it for DSC. Then protection and disaster recovery. I'll cover these a little tiny bit later, but essentially it's backup as a service. Allow you to back up any of your infrastructure to the cloud or your infrastructure in the cloud to the cloud. And of course, the last one is security and compliance. OMS gives you the ability to really analyze the security threats that are in your Azure infrastructure, as well as your infrastructure that's on-prem. So it truly is a hybrid security and compliance service. So a couple of things, just to kind of give you a little bit better insight into log analytics. Essentially, the data for log analytics can come from anywhere. It can come from web servers, it can come from databases, networks, logs, whatever you need to analyze, you can import it into this engine, and OMS provides the search engine that allows you to dig into it. So lots of really good use cases here. I highly recommend taking a look at this much deeper because it actually has a free tier that you can experiment with. Okay, jump right past that. And this is one of the most important ones that I see customers jumping into, and this is Azure Site Recovery. So what Azure Site Recovery does is it is a service that allows me to use Azure as a secondary data center for failover. For instance, if I have a giant VMware infrastructure on premises and I want to set up a secondary data center, well, I have two choices. I can either set up a secondary data center and use VMware to replicate to that other data center. You can actually still use Azure Site Recovery to orchestrate that failover, or if I don't want to go through the whole expense of building an entire new data center, I can literally just use ASR to fail over that entire VMware infrastructure to the cloud. It's significantly cheaper. It's like $54 a server, last I looked at least. And of course, you don't have to buy a data center. So there's certainly some cost benefit there. And the second scenario, of course, is if you have multiple data centers, you can actually use ASR to do the replication between the two. Okay, and this does support VMware physical servers and, of course, Hyper-V and System Center. So it's pretty flexible on what the workloads it supports from a failover perspective. So we're running a little bit short on time here. So I'm going to show you the OMS demo. And the OMS demo is essentially what I can do is inside the OMS gallery, I can go in and again, I'm showing you the super easy stuff because I don't have enough time to go too deep. But essentially what you're looking at is a bunch of predefined queries that I can run on all my data. So for instance, if I'm running SQL Analytics in the cloud, or I'm running backup, I can actually apply these solutions on my existing infrastructure and basically make sure that, you know, I can have OMS track my data for me. So these are predefined, but of course, anything that I predefine, I can actually have it automatically defined too. So let's take a look at one of them, like the anti-malware assessment. See if it loads. Let's see. Well, maybe we'll skip the OMS one since the analytics is deciding not to load. Let's try one more. We will try security audit. All right, OMS is not agreeing at the moment. So, oh, there we go. Yeah, I was about to say, typically what you'd get is you'd load this up and it's going to give you some options for enabling alerts. And it's also going to tell you, you know, this one is basically analyzing a few virtual machines I have deployed in my subscription, but it's going to tell me which ones are missing security updates, which ones don't have endpoint protection, or that are missing critical updates. Accounts failed to log in. There's all kinds of things that are literally, I just booted these VMs up, not done anything to them, obviously, and OMS is telling me that. So if I dig into this, it can actually tell me a lot of things that I can do to fix this. So it's a very powerful engine, and this is all out of the box. There's tons of things you can do to customize this and make it a lot deeper. So that's kind of hybrid in a nutshell. Probably run over a little tiny bit on this webinar just because we have a few more things to talk about. So a couple of things I want you to know from a governance perspective. So whenever you're thinking about governance in Azure, you have a lot of different tools at your disposal. You have the Azure EA portal, which is if you're an enterprise customer, it's a portal that allows you to manage your enterprise subscriptions all in a single location. Of course, you have Azure AD. This is where you'll manage all your users and groups, and that goes hand in hand with role-based access control. And in role-based access control, it's basically the tool that you use to grant the users and groups in Azure AD access to different services in Azure itself. So again, it's the tool that you use for all your permissions. But it's not just that. There's also other features called resource locks. One of the things that I like to highlight is you saw me create VMs super easy, and it isn't very easy to spin up VMs in Azure. It's also just as easy to delete them. And what a resource lock does is it basically gives a second opportunity to block someone from accidentally deleting your production workload. It basically means that they have to be an admin. They have to say, yes, I am intentionally unlocking this before they can delete something. That's the entire use case, is to prevent you from accidentally deleting something. Then you have other tools. You have OMS, templates, command line. These are all very valuable tools that when used in conjunction with each other make it very easy. Well, I wouldn't say easy, but it make it possible to apply governance to your Azure subscriptions. So a little bit more about the EA portal. The EA portal is where you actually go to create the structure of how your company looks to Azure. Now, why does that matter? It really matters because you kind of want to model the EA portal how you do your business, or at least how you want to do chargeback. That could be, creating different departments for, or a department for product development or marketing or sales, or it could be specifically for a product. Like this is the e-commerce department, and anything there we want to actually the bill to roll up to. And that's really what you're thinking about here is, who's going to manage subscriptions in each department and how does the cost get reported. So that's kind of where the EA portal comes from. Like I mentioned, RBAC is the service that you'll use to control who can do what inside of an Azure subscription. And policies are very similar to role-based access control, except they are used to define what can actually be done in a subscription. And whenever you have a policy defined, it doesn't matter who you are. So you could be the admin, and if a policy is there, you can't do anything until, of course, as an admin, you can change the policy. But it's role agnostic on what access is allowed inside of a subscription. And another feature I'll show you real quick is the Azure Security Center. Security Center is a really nice service. It's very similar to what we just saw with OMS, except it's automatic. Like I've done absolutely no configuration for it. And when I go into it, it's going to tell me all this, the stupid things I have not done yet on all my Azure infrastructure. And we can go in and actually turn it on from free to advanced, and it will actually turn on some more advanced threat analytics for me that will do threat detection using Microsoft's actual intrusion detection network. So it's a very nice free piece of technology, but with the paid version, you also get some very advanced security monitoring capabilities built into it. And of course, Agility Cloud Sandbox. I think Javier mentioned that at the very beginning. One of the things that you don't really get the ability to do with Azure EA Portal is give everyone in your company access to Azure kind of at scale, because there's no such thing as a spending limit on an EA subscription. So if you have a $100,000 commit, someone could easily go spend $100,000 and blow up your whole EA on accident because they were experimenting. So it's a little risky, but what our sandbox does is it allows you to buy Azure from us just for learning or experimentation. It's definitely not a production environment, but it allows you to really give access to everyone in your company access to Azure, and they can have a hard budget. So you can literally tell them that everyone on this team has $200 each, and if they exceed that, we actually stop them from doing anything. So again, this is how you give access to everyone in Azure at scale without risking your budget. Definitely makes your life a lot easier. All right, so I'm going to running a little bit short on time, so I think the only one I'm going to cover right now is Security Center. Just so you know it's there, because it's just built in if you already have Azure. And when I do training classes, I always get the same look. People always, while they're in their subscriptions, they always learn in their production subscription. They jump into Security Center and they realize all the stuff that they need to do. So right out the bat, this is always a good experiment for you to take in your own world. If I open this, you can kind of see the kind of things it's telling me to do. It's telling me in this case that I have a storage encryption is not enabled. I can turn that on really easy. For compute, it's telling me that I don't have endpoint protection turned on, missing updates, I'm missing disk encryption, all kinds of things that it can actually enable for me as well. So if I'm brave enough, I can literally go in here and click install on 3 VMs, and it will do that for me. So, all depends on your measure of risk. So definitely take a look at Security Center. It's certainly it's a free service that everyone should absolutely be taking advantage of. Okay, so final topic of our webinar for the day is Azure Platform as a Service. So Platform as a Service, one thing I really want to highlight here is, of course, we've already talked about that everyone already covers, starts in IaaS world, but where everyone should eventually go with new applications at least, not, of course, maybe not your core infrastructure, but for new applications is PaaS, simply because it lowers your area of responsibility. The one thing that you have to know about this, of course, is it doesn't do it itself. You have to have a developer build the application using these services to really get the advantage of it. And of course, as long as that's part of your journey to the cloud, then it's a really good model. So what we typically see in the training world, at least, and we work with a lot of customers in the enterprise to help them get on this plan to Azure, is essentially they start, and they always start in IaaS, rightfully so. That's exactly the right place to start. But once they get further along, they see this, this big movement towards building new applications in the PaaS world. And this is where they can scale up. They can build new applications faster because they're not having to worry about managing the infrastructure, because Microsoft takes care of that for you. So again, this is definitely something that if it's not on your roadmap, you should probably start putting it there. Okay, so just based off, I think this is a Forrester survey of some initial customers back in 2016 that had already went to IaaS and really started to looking over PaaS, you can see that overall the numbers speak for themselves. There's a huge return on investment, lots of time saved in IT, and of course faster time to market because you're working on services that already exist versus actually building that infrastructure from scratch. Okay, I want to give you a quick example, and if I wanted to build a web farm, right? In my on-premises world, I basically have this manual configuration of load balancing, virtual machine networking, manual install of services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at that, all those time-consuming things are exactly the same in the infrastructure-as-a-service world in Azure. Yes, I can put the VMs up faster than I can buy a new server, but in the scheme of things, the management of this stuff is all the same, right? I have to manage all the content deployment. I have to figure out which runtime works, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, with IaaS, you don't have to worry about managing data center, which of course is a huge plus. Now, if I'm on a platform as a service model, I don't even really have to worry about the load balancer. It does that for me. The services are managed automatically, so if I'm deploying the latest Java, it does it for me. I don't really have to worry about it. If I have to scale out to 50 web servers, I don't have to worry about making sure the content's the same on all 50. It does that for me. I have all these different services I can call to automatically add compute like web jobs, and I have databases that are super easy as well. So again, PaaS is definitely the one where you want to be for new application design. So let me give you a really quick example. This is already built, so we're not going to build it on scratch. But essentially what I built is an enterprise web app that uses a few services. It uses Azure Web Apps for hosting a website. It uses Azure Active Directory for authentication, and it uses SQL database for the database. So this is essentially exactly what my application would look like. And as you see, whenever we run it, there's absolutely no servers here. There's nothing for an IT pro to actually go worry about whether we're running out of disk space or that they need to patch or anything like that. Now, the IT pro still does have to worry about, are we scaled correctly? Or did we turn on auto scale rules? Because if you guys have all worked with developers, they'll pick the absolute highest capacity that they can, whether they need it or not, and they're not going to be cost effective. So having those two teams talk to each other and come to a happy medium is really where the work comes in. And of course, making sure the applications are secure, we're using the right directory, and there's lots of things that go together here. Security and monitoring are the two top priorities. So let's kind of jump out. Instead of going through all the services, I'm really just going to jump out and I'm going to show you what these applications consist of. And this will be the final demo. So if I go down to Events Web Webinar RG, what you see here is we're actually, this is a resource group that has my web app. It has a staging site, so if I want to have my developers deploy any changes and actually test them first, which is a great idea, we can do that. And I have my database, so I'm not managing SQL servers, and SQL Server, just think about the overhead you're losing here. This database right here automatically provides me the ability to back up to any point in time or to restore to any point in time over the last 35 days if I wanted to, just with a couple of clicks. That same capability in SQL does exist, and it's tremendously more complicated. If I wanted to make this database where I could replicate it to another region for redundancy, or just because I had customers in that region, it's super easy to go under geo-replication. If I can find it, there it is. And I'm sure everyone that's ever set up a SQL Server always on availability group will appreciate this. If I pick that region, all I have to do is create a database server in that region. Has to be unique, give it a username and a password. And click OK. And now I have officially set up a asynchronous replication between these two databases. Again, that is where the power of PaaS comes in, because anyone that's ever done the opposite with, or the same with SQL knows it's usually a multi-day operation. So that's basically the entire set of resources for my web app. I'll show you, it's not too fancy right now, but it does do some enterprise things, like it does now have multi-region availability at the database level. And to be honest, it would not take that much to make it at the web level too. So I'm going to go ahead and log in, and this is another enterprise feature. I'm actually having it log into my Active Directory account. And basically what this app did is just logged into my Azure AD tenant, which could actually log into Active Directory on premises. It pulled all this meta information out of the directory, just like if you were using an application that did ADSI the old days in Active Directory. So again, true enterprise capability, all just from no server workloads. So again, I apologize that we're over time. Appreciate your patience very much. I will stick around for the next 5 to 10 minutes to answer any questions over chat. So if you have any, definitely let me know. But again, thank you very much for attending our webinar. I hope it was very helpful.